In reading a little bit on the study, the author was saying that actually it's a little bit misnomer talking about happiness. He said the question is more one of well-being, and that's kind of what the Harvard study focuses on, is how you can have well-being in your mental and physical life, in your work life, in your relationships. And so it's not a success model, I think, in terms of optimizing happiness. It's that if you're connected in relationships in some kind of deep, integral way, you'll have a resourcefulness to navigate the full complexity of life.
The Reverend John Merz is an Episcopal minister and currently serves as pastor of the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. He has previously served as chaplain at NYU and various Manhattan congregations. Alongside his ministry, Reverend Merz is also a co-founder of the North Brooklyn Angels, a local nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing pressing issues such as hunger, poverty, homelessness, and inequitable access to resources through volunteer-driven direct action projects. Join Lewis and I today as we speak with the Reverend Merz about humans' constant search for meaning and chasing the good life. How does technology play into that? Who knows? It may make life easier, but does it make us happier? The pandemic accelerated development of virtual meeting technology, but most people report feeling lonelier than ever. Our special guest will help us understand if the modern age is making us more connected or more disconnected.
Welcome to What I See, the podcast where we uncover the stories of visionaries, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Join us as we explore the big ideas and challenges shaping our future. And now our hosts, Mark O'Donnell and Lewis Schiff.
Hey, Dr. Lewis, how's it going?
Dr. Lewis, that's damn right it's Dr. Lewis to you, Mark.
Don't let anybody forget it.
I mean, I know we have a prior existing relationship, but for God's sakes, it's Dr. Lewis.
Yes, right. It must be Dr. Lewis. So just tell our listeners, how did you become Dr. Lewis? Because people who know you, they probably aren't going to believe it.
Right. In fact, it turns out that I am actually not a college graduate, but I am today a PhD holder. Yes, well, there's a secret to my success, Mark. Part of that secret is being very good friends with a man named Norm Brodsky, who endowed a college business school called the Norm Brodsky College of Business. Norm Brodsky and I have worked together a lot for years. He graduated from a college called Rider University, which is out there in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, really in the shadow of Princeton University. Of course, Princeton is globally known and Rider nobody knows, but in fact, they're roughly the same age. And what Rider has been doing for 200 years is inviting first in the families to go to individuals to go to college. So it's got this incredible student population. And Norm graduated. He was asked to, fund something and name something, and he did that. And then he brought me in to help with this program that we run between Rider and Oxford University called Moonshots and Moneymakers, which has a really fun story behind how it got started. But the bottom line is I do bring 25 Rider students. So these are, young people from, hard scrabble backgrounds to a place like Oxford, which is a very uplifting place. And I've been doing it for a few years, and the school decided to recognize that contribution to the community.
Well, that's awesome. Congratulations, and you deserve it. And the reality is you've been doing the work and research on what makes for great entrepreneurial businesses for decades anyway, so you deserve it. It's good to be recognized for it anyway. And I like
Thanks,
seeing
Mark.
the picture of you in your little cap and your little sash or whatever they want to call
I know.
it.
Well, first of all, let me just share with you, you may know this already, but those things are like 100% polyester. Nothing is breathing under there. So for 3 hours, you were like cooking. It's like a sous vide. And that was brutal. And then of course, although I didn't know any of this, but everything has meaning. The sash has meaning, the colors have meaning, the this has meaning, that has meaning. So it's ritual. You know this. We all know this ritual, and of course this is going to feed into our topic today.
Mhm.
But part of life is rituals, and that's how we connect with each other. And I kind of make fun of almost everything that institutions do, but every once in a while I'm brought into an institutional environment like a college graduation, with 1,000 young people and another 10,000 of their family members, and you're kind of like blown away by the ritual of a stage of life, like, for example, graduating college.
Mhm. And it's really interesting in the context. All of those students, they're looking forward into their future. They've been told that graduating college is part of living a good life, a happy life. It makes your future bigger than your past, and it's the beginning of a fantastic journey. And of course, we know that sometimes it is, and sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
isn't.
Yeah.
And kind of introducing the topic today, I've been reading a book called The Good Life by Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz. And what the book is a culmination of the largest longitudinal study of human happiness. Started at Harvard, I believe, in 1938. It was a few hundred Harvard students, and it was from people from the neighborhood. It started out as just men, and it expanded since then to different genders and race and things. But it's the longest study of its type. It's generational. So they didn't just study the original participants, but it's their children and their grandchildren, sometimes their great grandchildren, about what it is to live a good life. How do people become happy? And I'm pretty sure it actually has nothing to do with being a college graduate or not. Not that those people wasted their money
Right.
at all, but it really has nothing to do with living a good life, a happy life. So, what do you think
Yeah.
about?
Well, yeah. Well, it would be wonderful if this thing called college, and this is only a small part of what we want to talk, what you just brought up with the good life, but there was this idea once that a place called college was where you were opened up to the world,
Mhm.
and that's where humanities and liberal arts kind of came into the fold. And those things are, the cost of college relative to the value of being a good student of the humanities or liberal arts is just hard to justify these days for most families. So I think you're right in that college has kind of gotten off course in terms of, yeah, it used to be a place where you became more worldly after 4 years. Now it's sort of most supposed to prepare you for some kind of career, and then that's just a sad loss for that worldliness that it once represented.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the adjacent possible, right? And if you go forward, college should open up, as you learn, open up new and new ideas and possibilities to the learner over time. And years ago, that might have been the only method in which you would be exposed to new ideas, to enter into those new adjacents. But now you just go online and ask ChatGPT to open up the door for you, and it does.
Yeah, right, right. It's funny though.
Yeah.
Just real quick, you have kids that are college age. I have an 18-year-old, and when I spoke to the college advisor about what I thought would be best for Jake, the college advisor in his high school, I said, wherever his heart takes him, so long as he's passionate about it, I don't. I'm willing to spend the money on whatever that path is, as long as it means something to him. Well, of course, kids will always do the opposite of what you've like laid out for them. So he basically said, I want to become an engineer. I want to get a good job when I'm done. And I was like, kid, I'm like inviting you to study anything, art history, anything. And he's picking engineering, which is like one of the most employable fields there is. So
Right.
this is how kids get you every time.
Right. Well, hey, at least he's hitting the ball down the middle of the fairway, you know?
Well said.
Yeah. So as we move to the kind of deep dig into the good life, my question, one of the things, the statements that they make in the book, after just all of this data about how humans interact with one another, is that science is finally catching up to ancient wisdom that has been around for millennia. That's a pretty big statement, because I think ultimately humans, we are really good at doing the opposite of what's actually good for us. And so we spend all of this time searching, looking, digging for this kind of sense of belonging and fulfillment, when it's really kind of been in front of us for quite a long time,
Yeah,
maybe forever.
maybe forever.
Maybe forever.
Well, I'm going to bring on a friend of mine from the neighborhood in Brooklyn, where I work. This is the Reverend John Merz. John is an Episcopal minister and serves as the pastor of the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. He has previously served as chaplain at New York University and other Manhattan congregations. One of the most interesting things about John and the way I met him is Reverend Merz is a co-founder of the North Brooklyn Angels, a local nonprofit organization that I happen to volunteer with, dedicated to addressing pressing issues such as hunger, poverty, homelessness, and inequity. Father John, why don't you join us here at the podcast? And so he appears out of the mist. Thank you for joining us, John. Thanks for sharing your point of view. We chatted earlier in the week, and Mark and I talked about the topic of the podcast at the beginning of the week, and I love this topic that he brought to us. When you and I were talking, we were talking about how you have a background both as somebody who studied divinity, and secondly as somebody who's an active community organizer. Which is, if you take away the sort of politics of the word, it's about getting people to work with one another and get things done together. Mark, why don't you lead us off? I just want, I know that your questions are super profound, and I know that John's got a mind for the profound.
Yeah. So, as I just said, the Harvard study starts in 1938. They've done all this research. They've used scientific methods. They've studied in the study, they would put the participants in fMRI scanners, and they would take their blood on a regular basis. And they're using all of the science that they could possibly muster. And it evolved over time. So they got better and better at collecting the data and analyzing and trying to understand what it means. But then for the ending hypothesis to be that it's been here all the time is kind of shocking in and of itself. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of that. It's probably makes you chuckle a little bit, given what you do, all these crazy people searching for things that are right in front of them.
Yeah, well, thank you first of all, for having me on. And this is, as you mentioned, it's an enormous topic. And it's a topic that's, if you go back or speaking earlier, I was listening to you talk about liberal arts education. And this is really the question that dominates early philosophy. What is the good life? What is the life worth living? And so this has been a perennial question. And so it is interesting. In I've done some reading this week on the study and on the findings of the study, and it is in fact, their findings are one of those things, as you've mentioned, that sits right in front of our face, and we're searching for it all the time. And what people are searching for is how to make life meaningful and to feel connected to themselves and to feel connected to those around them. And so as somebody who works in a community and pastors at a church, most of the time you encounter people, or when people see me, say if I'm wearing the conventional costume of the clergy person, they'll talk with you when they're feeling particularly disconnected. They'll think you have some special knowledge to give them, or they want to share with you how they feel disconnected. And I think it's generally a very common experience for anybody in life to feel disconnected periodically, especially when you're young. You feel disconnected or out of the stream or your own uniqueness. You're puzzling that over. How do I fit in? How do I not fit in? Um, but I think we're at a particular point right now because of what's happened over the last few years, where so much has changed, and the ways that people connect have changed so much that more and more people are emerging that feel profoundly disconnected from their communities, from their work relationships, or in their work relationships. Even I would even say to the way they do work. It's not just the work relationships they have among the people they work, but even the very way in which they've always done their work has changed. With no
So I'm
training.
wondering, what's that?
With no training for it. It was all kind of
Right.
like, okay, now we'll change everything.
Right. That's kind of what I get stuck on with this. It's so easy for the three of us, if you just look at us, to call us sort of crabby middle-aged men, or middle-aged people even. Um, but I am watching, and we had a quick back and forth this week. Um, you know, I keep wondering, when tools that are put in front of us that make us feel disconnected, why are we so drawn to these tools? And so the two that come to mind that again make us look like we're a little out of touch is people play video games endlessly, and they're essentially disconnected from the things they're doing in that video game, and B, other people. And secondly, there's this rise of the influencer, these people who want to live a life on camera so that they can project a certain life to people. But, we keep hearing that people who live that life feel lots of pressure to keep living that life. And it has this negative effect on the people who watch that life. They think they're supposed to live lives like that. Why isn't our own enlightened self-interest to live satisfying lives that are connected? Why are we making decisions that take us farther and farther away from that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that well, let me attack it the other way for a second. One of the things you've kind of named the symptom or how it's playing out, and I'll go to the cure, at least as I've experienced it. And we're encountering more and more people. Let's say, for instance, at the North Brooklyn Angels, which every day of the week there's an opportunity to cook in your community, to distribute food in your community, and people who are educated, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and of course all different walks of life, and coming down and getting involved and being absolutely astounded almost at how gratifying it is. It's almost as if they've stumbled upon some kind of I think they almost feel like they're stealing something. Like, how could this be so connecting? To come into a room with 17, 16 other people and prepare food and then put it in boxes and bring it out to trucks and distribute it into the community. And I haven't really done anything that's particularly extraordinary. That calls all of this training I might have gotten in college or in my work field. But I think we don't really recognize, I think, often what makes us tick as human beings. Aristotle said, man is by nature a social animal. And he was talking in particular about political when he said social, but we need to be together. People need to be around other people. We need to be mirrored and reflected when we do positive things. We need to feel the closeness. In your opening, you said we're from. You met me in the neighborhood, and I always reflect on that word with people because it comes from the word to be nigh, which means to be close to. So it has to do with being close to people and rubbing elbows with people and just experiencing other people. And I think the online world is very seductive because there's so much time saving and convenience in it. But real relationships are not very convenient. Especially, lasting relationships go through tremendous trials and pains and ruptures. Like if we could build an online relationship, it just couldn't be, tremendously satisfying. I mean, if that was it, like how good are the friendships that are just formed on Zoom? And how good are the arguments and discussions and debates that just happen online? They're evacuated of all of the nuance that happens when people are together. And so I think, people connecting to service in their community, connecting to other people, simply sitting out on the stoop, gathering to be with other people in completely meaningless ways.
Yeah.
Bowling, not to disparage bowling, but
Right. Ways that just connect us and crisscross us.
yeah.
Yeah. I also think it's really interesting because the book and the science behind it substantiates what it is that you're saying, is that there's neurochemicals that are released when you're in close proximity to another person. There was one case where there was a person with PTSD, and they were putting him in the fMRI scanner and the MRI machine, and he got very agitated and nervous, and his wife touched his hand. And as soon as she did that, his brain just completely switched off in terms of all the anxiety dissipated. They could see what was happening there. And so they started to research that further. And even just being next to someone. What they also talk about, and so you can never, of course, have that experience on Zoom or online, having that close proximity to another human, it just doesn't work. But the other thing was what they discuss is that they show a picture taken by a young Stanley Kubrick of all people in 1940s of a New York train car, and every single person's head is down. And you're thinking like, was this staged? And this is like everyone's looking at their iPhone, but no. So then they took a new one, and everyone's exactly the same thing, all looking down. So it's not necessarily the invention of technology and smartphones. They just happen to be looking at their newspaper, and everyone else is looking at their smartphone, most likely in the most recent one. And so the thought there is that we are just really bad at doing what's good for us, and our brains are just hardwired to take in as much information as possible. They went a little bit further and said, well, how happy is a person if they actually talk to their seatmate on a train or on a plane versus putting their nose down in? And it's just an exponential increase in gratification when you have the conversation with the human versus sticking your nose in the book, the magazine, the tablet, the computer, whatever it is. It's almost in our nature to do the opposite of what's good for us.
Absolutely. And I think that you have, the one of the things that does happen, I think the difference from reading the newspaper, though, to the social media is that we, because of algorithms and other things, we tend to get in feedback loops of the same type of information. Whereas if everybody in the car is reading the same newspaper and you're reading the whole newspaper, you're going to be subject to reading articles you're not pleased with or you don't particularly like, and having to encounter those kinds of things. It reminds me of something, to mention somebody that was already mentioned in the podcast, if I can, because I was listening to you guys at the outset, and I happen to know this person as well. Lewis mentioned Norman Brodsky. And one of the things that Norm always said, and I've listened to, is when you go into a room, or if you go to an event, a community event, always talk to new people. Always seek out people you haven't spoken to. Don't gravitate towards the same people, which would be the kind of social media style. Is I'll do the same thing because I know I'll get gratified there. But not only is it a smart kind of business practice, but it's a good emotional practice to be surprised by other people. And then you have the opportunity to meet new people, um, to grow, to be surprised, to be changed, and to put yourself into new situations, which is kind of what you were talking about earlier. Being a cosmopolitan person is just to be comfortable in a larger world, theoretically speaking.
So I'd like to challenge both of you. Mark was saying earlier that one of the things that they discovered in the study was the release of certain neurochemicals. So let's, none of us are neuroscientists, but let's just say there's some identifiable way inside your brain that says, hey, I like this, let's do more of this. Now, let's say Mark, who is an entrepreneur, is pitching a new business idea. It's a set of, AR, VR goggles that go around your head and your ears, and he can introduce you to images and things that would make that chemical get released. So you really wouldn't have to go down to the stoop anymore, because he can essentially get that chemical out of you in another way. And let's say he's pitching to you, John, and it wants you to be the spokesperson for this because you believe in connection. He's told you the connection gets reduced to a chemical experience. So he says, I can make you feel that same connection. We're going to make $1 billion. If we do this, I want to put a face on this product and I think it's yours, this connection guy. How would you guys work that out?
Well, from an ethical standpoint, I couldn't be involved. and the reason I wouldn't be involved is because, in reading a little bit on this study, the author was saying that actually it's a little bit misnomer talking about happiness. He said the question is more one of well-being. And that's kind of what the Harvard study focuses on, is how you can have well-being in your mental and physical life, in your work life, in your relationships. And so it's not a success model, I think, in terms of optimizing happiness. It's that if you're connected in relationships in some kind of deep, integral way, you'll have the resourcefulness to navigate the full complexity of life. So to me, I wouldn't be interested in a VR system like that, because it's going to create for you the release of dopamine and these various things. But you have to have both sides of it. I mean, life is only joyful because it's incredibly, as Roberto Benigni said in, I think, Down by Law, it is a sad and beautiful world. It's all of these things. And so, well-being has to do with also connected to your nature and the way you are when you get the phone call that your mother or father has stage 4 cancer, or you do, or your spouse does, or your child does. I mean, it would be inappropriate to run and put those VR goggles on in that moment. But it would be totally appropriate to go and sit with that person or with another family member and cry and hold each other, which would in its own way release those connective, I'm sure it would release something that would be cathartic, some internal chemical. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's not just about you, it's about your impact of everyone else around you. And if let's just say we start up, ABC dopamine norepinephrine company, which, by the way, there was a study that did this in rats, and they implanted an electrode in their brain, and every time they hit a button, it would give them a hit of all the chemicals. And what ended up happening is the rat didn't eat, it didn't drink, it didn't have sex, it didn't do anything, and it just kept hitting the button till it died. That's all that happened.
Not a bad way to go.
Just hitting a button. I mean, but so if you had this, it would be the company as the intermediary to all human happiness. There would be no interpersonal impact. There'd be no caring. There would really be no meaning. Ultimately, I don't think it it would be a good way to make money. And maybe that's exactly what's happening now is that we have
Right, of course.
intermediary to neurochemicals that are just making us hit the button.
Yeah, but I mean, at some level, I don't, I work at Rider University with 20 somethings. I have my own kid, but just objectively, I'm around about 20 or 25 20 somethings every semester. And the topic we teach is entrepreneurship. Mark has come in to teach to the class, and the big top, the 50,000 foot topic is really: are you prepared to expose yourself to risk, which is sort of intertwined with entrepreneurship? And from a personal level, it's almost always the case that they struggle with being risk oriented because they say the social media world presents everyone's lives as being so wonderful. I can't contemplate being a failure or a loser. And so, to that point, Mark, why are people surrounding themselves with, they'll call it content, but really messages that seem to make them feel bad about themselves in the end, or kind of lock themselves in? I am a volunteer at Father John's North Brooklyn Angels. So when I do go there, I work in a kitchen with people, and your hands get dirty, and then we put it all in a truck. We hand it off to people. It's like by far the best part of my week, by far, like no question. It's also tiring. You're a little beat up afterwards because you've been up and down the stairs carrying food. But why are we so easily, is convenience the only answer about why we would so easily just fire up Instagram rather than go out and help feed people who are nothing but smiles when you feed them? Why is that such a hard choice?
Well, we have a never-ending propensity to do the opposite of what's good for us. I think that's ultimately the answer, but you have they're addictive in nature. It's releasing all the appropriate neurochemicals that your brain loves, and then you feel bad afterwards. And the other thing I was thinking about when you were saying that is the opposite of happiness, or to your point, John, well-being, is unhappiness, right? And I really do think that expectations that are unmet is the source of all unhappiness. Have you ever been to Jamaica?
Yeah,
I have.
It's in my experience, very happy people. So I was at the resort. Guy's super happy. He's just having the best time ever. And he was working at the resort, and I was like, "Oh, so where do you live? Do you live close by?" He's like, "I'll show you." So he takes me over to the wall of the resort. We stand on a chair, and he points to a small 8x8 cinder block hut kind of thing, dirt floor. He's like, "That's my house." I'm like, "Oh, okay." He's like, "It's everything I need, nothing I don't. It's perfect." Expectations were perfectly met for him, where there was no gap between what he expected for himself and what he was currently experiencing. He felt like he had everything he needed.
He was the richest man in the world.
He was the richest man in the world. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think that's where you get all the unhappiness from copious amounts of this curated lives that young people and everyone really are seeing.
John, post-COVID, so many things have changed. You could just spend a lifetime talking about these things. But what have you seen in terms of connectivity between people, self-fulfilling or fulfilling relationships over the last 2-3 years?
You mean post-COVID?
Well, I know COVID obviously took us all physically apart from one another. But as we've tried to get back to, I don't know, quote unquote normal, have you seen people, is it coming back better than it was before? Is it harder than it was before? Is it different than it was before?
Well, in my work, I encounter a lot of people who want to have discussions, and it sounds like, for many people, it feels like they stepped off a moving train and they can't get back on, and they feel that other people have gotten back on, and they can't understand, is it physical? Is it emotional? Maybe they had COVID and they're wondering if they have long COVID. So I encounter a lot of people who want to have pastoral discussions about that, about what, what can I do? Or is this depression? Trying to figure out. And, I have no easy answers for that at all. I'm not just generally not an easy answer person to begin with, but, try to help people I try to help people navigate the complexity of what they're seeing in the society around them, what they're feeling in their bodies, what might have changed in their work, and begin to tease out all of these things and have them have an appreciation that things really have changed a lot. And then, we'll often talk to people about small connections that people can make. I have seen, not to just keep going back to this, but we've seen a lot of younger people just connecting to service in their community. And it was one of the curious things that happened with our organization during the pandemic. A lot of people, well, we saw this everywhere, but people made drastic career changes because all of a sudden they said, what I've been doing, it just doesn't feed me. And so we saw a number of people come and volunteer and decide they wanted to go into social work, or they wanted to go into a nonprofit. They might have been working for, Spotify or somebody, and they said, I want to try to change into another field. So, those are just the basic elements. I wonder, I want to touch back on something you said before. I was thinking about two different things. One is that our expectations and what we look for are obviously shaped by the larger cultural context. So if you're, if you're in, the 14th century, if you're like a 14th century Ashkenazic Jewish community in France and Germany, your life is going to be connected by a whole network of Jewish cultural kinship relations and expectations. And it's going to be very specific to that cultural place and time. And you're going to feel you belong to an integral world. You're needed in that world. And you see this in all kinds of communities like that. And I think one of the things that's happening is people are finding identity markers in online communities of belonging that don't have any substance or depth. They don't have any, so you become part of an ideological political movement. And you have this on all elements of the political spectrum, all sides of the political spectrum, where you bond over these particular issues in these forums, but there's no kind of integrated connection to just to being together, which you would have in any kind of stable ritual identity community. I don't know if that makes any sense, but kind of from a ritual and community anthropology point of view, like that's the togetherness thing. A lot is transmitted to people when they come together around these kinds of cultural markers. That we seem to be losing a lot of that.
Mark's point at the outset was, I don't think he meant it this way, but it's almost like an aha or a gotcha. Like, we've done all this study for almost 100 years, and guess what? It's really what we always thought it was. But I'm just going to put out there, I'm still open to that. It can change. The ancient ideas of connectivity, community, togetherness are still huge. I love all that stuff. But who's to say that person who's connecting to some online community, even if it's going into some weird, wacky ideological spaces, you said you said, I don't know what the word you used, John, was it empty or it's false or something, but you definitely didn't say anything good about it. And so are you sure? Are you sure that it's not good? Are you sure it's not? Are you sure that's not a 21st century way of connecting with other people that's more digital, but somehow equally or even more satisfying?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I have my intuition about it, I think that's one of the symptoms of. I mean, I guess this would happen all the time, but we tend to throw out these our judgments in this same kind of declarative way. You know, I had a friend when I was in seminary in 2004, and we started, or 2002, and we started with discussion boards in these early, the early form. And he was a transfer student from Oxford, and we were all doing work on these boards. And he said, "I don't quite understand you Americans and this online thing." He said, "You and your assertion boards." He called them assertion boards. Um, it wasn't really a discussion board, but I can't say that that these aren't um, fulfilling. They don't serve a particular function. There's lots of ways in which they're very helpful. I just think they can't replace genuine, unpredictable community where people have to rub elbows and encounter each other on a daily basis, get into uncomfortable spaces, navigate them, build sustaining longer term relationships, all of the nonverbal cues that happen physically. I don't, I go back to Aristotle. We're meant to be social. We're meant to be near each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's even one last thing, like even in a monastery, which is like, people imagine that a monastery is an isolating, hermetic place of aloneness. It's actually intense community, even if it's in silence. You're around people all the time. You can't get away from them. There's regular hours. It's incredibly intense. So I think anytime we actually get into isolating situations, that's when most people get into trouble, in terms of well-being, when they get really isolated away from other people. Not everybody, but in general,
Yeah. And Louis, I would just say that I think that there's a distinct difference between communicating, talking versus connecting. And to your point, John, when you have to live with these people, right? There's keyboard courage. People are all really courageous when they're sitting at their keyboards by themselves in their basement somewhere. But at the same time, they probably wouldn't say those things in person. And even if they would do it in a much different way, and they'd be more open. And all the research does suggest that it is impossible to achieve that total view of connection when you're not physically present, just based on brain scans and physical touch and the general proximity. It isn't possible. It's probably pretty good for a lot of people, but it's not complete.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, we all have work to do.
Now I kind of want to burn my phone and this is like the third time, Louis, that I've want to smash my phone after our conversations.
I know, because we keep going down these same rabbit holes.
Yeah.
So and the same irony. So one time, John he was talking about how he wants to move to, get off the grid, and he says, "I'm going to use Zillow to find a cabin off the grid."
Yeah, that's right.
Meanwhile, my daughter's 8 years old, and I was with somebody last night. We were talking about this very thing, and they said, maybe our children will work it out. They'll want to get rid of all this stuff. And I said, my daughter's 8 years old, and literally yesterday she wrote a manifesto like the Unabomber for why she should have a Chromebook. I mean, it was like 3 pages, all of the reasons laid out.
As long as she wrote it and she didn't outsource it to ChatGPT.
That's right. It looked like her writing. I'm not sure. She might have prompted that it sounds like a child.
Yeah.
Well,
that's very true.
And we have to appreciate the irony. We're talking about human connection while we all basically zoom into a podcast environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, John, thank you so much for joining us for a few minutes today and sharing your perspective and wisdom. Also, just because we crisscross in the neighborhood, thank you for what you do for Greenpoint to make it feel a little bit more connected.
Yeah, well, thank you for being a connector in it. So thank you.
Thanks, John.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Ciao. Thank you.
Bye.
Wow, that was heavy.
Yeah, it's a big conversation, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
not, and everyone is in their own way talking about this. I had dinner with some family yesterday, and my sister happens to have a completely online business. She's sort of an influencer in her own right. She makes pretty good money all online, and she just says, "I hate it. I want to quit."
I mean, part of her business is her own personal image.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a I don't know why that's so interesting to so many people, so attractive.
She feels alone, isolated, by herself. It's just her talking to a black box.
Yeah. Well, you and I continue to be very lucky people, because really our work is all about connecting with other people and making things happen between people. So we get a lot, that comment you made about the person you met in the resort in Jamaica. And I said, that's the richest man in the world. I often find myself feeling like the richest man in the world too. And it has a lot to do with the people around me.
Totally. When I've been going to, we had our EOS conference a couple weeks ago. I was at a Vistage Executive Summit this past week, and everyone is so happy to be with one another. There's just such a great energy when you put a bunch of, when you especially put a bunch of entrepreneurs in one place. They tend to be a little more extroverted, a little bit higher on.
They're like the dopamine button rat. They're like, give me more, give me more, give me more. Yeah, and then they're like totally exhausted.
Yeah. And most of them get it from being with other people. Like, it's really interesting to see entrepreneurial communities. They really gain a ton of energy from being with one another. They bounce ideas off each other, and it's very exhilarating to just be observing and talking with one another and see what happens. Yeah.
Well, on that note, let's go meet with other people and share some ideas. I have places to be. You have places to be, people to see. Thanks for taking some time out today, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. It's always a pleasure.
Okay. Thumbs up.
See you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of What I See, where we explore the stories of the visionaries shaping our world. We hope you found insights and inspiration from our guests. Don't forget to subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode, and continue to be a part of the conversation. See you next time on What I See.